What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I got another video for you guys. This is a video that is more informative than it is, I guess, entertaining in a way. I'm sure it's still entertaining because this person does like to throw in jokes and things like that in their videos. And this is a channel called Knowing Better. It is a channel that I've been subscribed to for a minute. I've watched almost all their videos, and this video in particular goes well with a topic, or not a topic, a subject that just recently passed, and that was voting season. There was a vote at the time of this recording yesterday where a lot of states in the United States were voting for pretty significant roles like gubernatorial races. I'm not sure if there was any congressional seats that were up for election. Usually that happens around the presidential elections or the end of the year. But in Ohio, we didn't really have anything. I had like a mayor to vote on and some councilmen. That was it. But there were some states out there that had some pretty significant votes. And this is a subject that goes in line with voting. This is called suppressing the vote. It's called disenfranchisement. For those of you that don't know anything about disenfranchisement, it is the ability, or not the ability, but it is usually principles and policies designed to keep certain groups from being able to vote. Now, a lot of times, especially in like the South during the Civil Rights Movement or Reconstruction until the Civil Rights Movement, there were laws that were put in place that were designed to keep African Americans or Black Americans from voting. Now, I don't really know off the top of my head if there was any other situations with other minority groups in America. It's very possible there were, especially like during the turn of the century when a lot of immigrants were coming in. I'm pretty sure they had something in place that was designed to impact them indirectly. That's usually how disenfranchisement works. It's always indirect. They don't necessarily vote. I mean, they don't necessarily just deny your vote, but they'll put obstacles in place to make it so hard that you choose to not vote. So let's go ahead and watch this, and then I will go ahead and talk more about examples in modern times that will talk about disenfranchisement.
Voting is a right here in America. Much like you have the right to free speech and the right to a firearm, you also have the right to vote. Though it used to be viewed more as a privilege, and we still kind of think of it that way. If you try to introduce a new rule that maybe curtails a few people from voting, aside from those few people affected, most other people don't seem to care. They might even be in favor of those rules. The only way to stop these rules from taking effect is to vote. So please, vote, assuming you still can.
Don't stick metal objects in outlets. Don't touch stove eyes. Don't put a can of soda in the freezer.
This video is brought to you by Skillshare.
You will know better
When
later.
America was founded, or rather a few years later when the Constitution went into effect, only white male Protestants over the age of 21, who also owned a not insignificant amount of land, were allowed to vote. When George Washington was elected in 1789, only 6% of the US population had the right to vote. Much like the definition of a citizen, the right to vote was both expanded and restricted over the years. By the 1840s, the property ownership requirement had disappeared. Then in 1870, after the bloodiest war in American history, the white requirement was removed by the 15th Amendment, allowing black males the right to vote. We had some issues with letting Asians and Native Americans vote, but that was cleared up later. In 1920, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote federally. Certain states had allowed it previously. And lastly, in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, lowering the voting age to 18. So that's it. As long as you're a US citizen over the age of 18, you're allowed to vote. And now, you know better.
It's not that simple.
Wait. Yeah, if only it were that simple. States decide who gets to vote, so aside from those few amendments I mentioned, we have no uniform federal rules. So every time the federal government extended the right to vote to a group, new state rules were put in place to limit how many people in that group could actually vote. Like after the Mexican-American War. When we annexed all that new territory with all those new people, America had a problem because at the time, Mexican people were still classified as white. So English literacy became a requirement, and it remained a requirement that was rather famously used to deny black people the right to vote for another 100 years under Jim Crow.
Yeah, that was, at the time, that was the literacy test that they would have, in which case you would have to pass a test in order to be able to vote. And of course, during slavery, black people weren't allowed to read or write, or were usually denied the ability to read or write. I'm not sure if it was necessarily illegal, but most, if not, well, not all, but a huge majority of slave owners would deny their slaves the right to the ability to read and write. So after they were freed, obviously when they implemented literacy tests, you grew up your entire life not being able to read or write, so chances are you would not be able to vote. So that was one way of disenfranchising a community while not necessarily outright making it illegal for them to vote.
Along with poll taxes, which meant you had to pay a fee every time you voted, which were eliminated by the 24th Amendment. It's a common misconception that felony disenfranchisement was started during Reconstruction or Jim Crow in order to suppress the African American vote. Felony disenfranchisement means that you lose the ability to vote if you've committed a certain level of crime. The idea is that you broke the social contract, so you shouldn't be allowed to participate in decisions that help shape that society or its rules. And you could argue that that makes sense for a little while, but forever? Forever, ever? We've actually had these rules since basically the beginning. Kentucky was the first state to enact criminal disenfranchisement in 1792, followed by Vermont in 1793, then Ohio and Louisiana. By the time the Civil War came around, most states in the North and South had some form of felony disenfranchisement. In fact, during Reconstruction, only one state expanded felony disenfranchisement in order to stop black people from voting. Can you guess which one? It's Alabama.
I was about to say Alabama.
Come on. Their constitution still has a rather long list of people who are disqualified from voting, including
all idiots and insane persons. That's off to a great start.
It should be noted that idiot was a medical term back then, but man, that has not aged well. But here's the list of crimes that disqualify you.
Those who shall be convicted of treason, murder, arson, embezzlement, malfeasance in office, larceny, receiving stolen property, obtaining property or money under false pretenses, perjury, subordination of perjury, robbery, assault with intent to rob, burglary, forgery, bribery, assault and battery on life, bigamy, living in adultery, sodomy, incest, rape, miscegenation.
If you needed any more proof that this was racially motivated, here you go. Miscegenation is marrying outside of your race. If a black man married a white woman, neither of them were allowed to vote. That section of the Constitution wraps up with a blanket statement.
Or any crime punishable by imprisonment in the penitentiary, or of any infamous crime or crime involving moral turpitude.
An infamous crime is usually defined as a felony. Many of the crimes on that list were retracted over time, but the felony part has not. Felony disenfranchisement on the whole is starting to disappear in the country as people start to realize that punishing someone for life well after their sentence was a bit much. In Maine and Vermont, there is no disenfranchisement. People are allowed to vote while in prison. These states allow you to vote once you're out of prison, and these states after probation or parole. These states allow you to vote after your sentence, but only for first-time offenders or nonviolent crimes. It varies by state. But in these 4 states, no felon of any kind ever gets to vote, ever.
Forever?
Yes. Well, unless the governor personally restores your rights. And the next governor doesn't immediately reverse that decision. Florida has the chance to change their color on that map in the election on Tuesday. But as felony disenfranchisement has been disappearing, a new form of voter suppression seems to be emerging. When you register to vote, you have to prove who you are and where you live. But some states are now requiring a separate ID when you actually vote. Voter ID laws are one of those things that just feel...
Okay, I'm gonna address this real quick, even though I'm pretty sure he's probably gonna talk more about it. Voter ID laws are something that are used to disenfranchise certain people because in inner cities, for example, well, this is something that actually affects inner cities the most because the type of ID you need to verify yourself, they don't necessarily, they use certain things that people in inner city might not have. So, for example, a driver's license. If you live in certain cities, you might not drive because it's the city. It's busy as hell, and it's probably more convenient to use public transportation, whether it's subways or whether it's buses, taxis, whatever else. So in cities, you will likely not, have a driver's license. And other forms of ID, like social security card. Well, I'm not sure. I don't think they use social security. Usually it's something that has to have a photo. So like a passport, things like that. Chances are people in inner city don't have that. And I don't want to say a majority of the inner city, but a majority of black people live in inner cities. So it's very likely they'll be less likely to have a driver's license. Very less likely to have a passport. I know I don't have a passport. And the thing is, in one particular case, I don't know the exact details. Somebody could probably find it for me. I will try to look for it at some point. But I remember there being a case where a particular community of people, they were in one of the states that had voter ID laws, and only way to vote was to use a driver's license. And in this community, many people didn't have driver's license, or at least many black people didn't have driver's license. So what the state did was, like, they closed down a bunch of DMVs in that area. So the closest DMV was like, I believe it was like over 50 miles away. So that was the nearest place you could go to get a driver's license. And obviously this is 50 miles away. You don't have a driver's license. You can't drive out there. So how are you going to go out there to get a new driver's license so you can vote? You can't. You can, but they make it a hell of a lot harder to do it. So a lot of people, if you have two choices of having to find some type of transportation to take you 50 miles out or just staying home, chances are you're probably just going to choose to stay home instead of doing all this extra stuff. So yeah, it's a bunch of stuff that's just designed to keep certain people from voting. And I know it doesn't affect just black people. There are other minority groups that it can affect. There are other communities that it might affect. It's more than just that, because, like, for example, I know in a lot of states they have gerrymandering where the state will be skewed in a certain political party's favor, and it's designed that way intentionally in order to keep that state voting a particular political group. And the people that are on the other side of the favored political group are going to have their voices suppressed because they now have a harder time trying to get their vote to matter.
Are now requiring a separate ID when you actually vote. Voter ID laws are one of those things that just feels like it makes sense, but the facts don't seem to line up with those feelings. Another example of this would be drug testing people on welfare. It costs way more than it saves. A common argument for voter ID is that you need one for all sorts of other things. You can barely get by without one, so it makes sense that you should have to prove who you are before you go vote. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, which is probably why a majority of Americans support the idea. Except you don't really need an ID for all sorts of other things. Unless you're a teenager. I couldn't tell you the last time I had to show anyone my ID. Not to get into an R-rated movie or buy spray paint or even alcohol. If I lived in a city that had decent public transportation, I probably wouldn't need an ID at all. Well, you need one to work, right? No, not really, no. When you got hired, your HR person gave you this list, and you probably just handed over your driver's license and social security card. But there's about a dozen other options available. And here's the kicker, those dozen other options, depending on the state, aren't valid voter IDs. 11% of Americans do not have a valid voter ID. I have an ID, and if you thought that me saying I can't remember the last time I had to show anyone my ID is far-fetched, 35 million Americans don't have an ID and seem to get along just fine. Except when it comes to this new rule about voting. If you lost your driver's license, it would be a pain. You'd have to take a few hours off of work, go to the DMV, sit there for a few hours, pay a fee, and then wait 6 to 8 weeks for it to arrive in the mail. It would be a whole thing. But you can justify it because you need it to drive. But if you take the bus to work every day and everything is fine, but now you find out you have to do all of that stuff in order to go vote when you didn't 2 years ago, you're probably probably just not gonna vote.
Yeah.
Voter ID laws vary by state, but there are currently 17 states with rather strict voter ID laws. The usual reasoning behind these laws is to stop voter fraud. And
I'm going to address one more thing. It's not something that he necessarily talks about in this, because this video is somewhat older. I think this was before what I'm about to talk about was even implemented, but in certain states they have created this new rule where you have to have been a voter within the last 8 years in order for you to continue to have your registered status. So like if you haven't voted within the last 8 years, they will unregister you and mark you down as an unregistered voter. So in a lot of places, this is a law that could impact particularly Black Americans. You know why? Because chances are a lot of Black Americans, the last time they voted was when Obama ran. So if they decide at some point that they want to get more active into politics and things like that, but they don't know about this 8-year voter law, because Ohio actually has to implement it, chances are the only way they would know is the day that they go to the election or go to cast their vote. They're going to go in, they're going to try to cast their vote, they're going to discover that they're not registered. In order to get registered, you know, chances are you're not going to be able to do it right there at that exact time. And by the time you get registered, chances are the vote's going to be over, in which case you're going to miss it. So, like I said, it indirectly affects African Americans. I know there are other groups as well that are probably less likely to vote, and it could hurt their chances of staying registered as well. But these are laws that, without a doubt, impact African Americans, or Black Americans. I keep saying African Americans. That impact Black Americans prominently. Now, like I said, it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect other people, but Black people are ones that are hit hard by this.
strict voter ID laws. The usual reasoning behind these laws is to stop voter fraud, and we've been told a lot in the last few years that voter fraud is a big problem, and the integrity of our ballot box is paramount. I'm not going to address the claim that millions of illegal immigrants are voting, because no, they aren't. That's ridiculous. But in most states that either have passed or are trying to pass voter ID laws, someone will claim that hundreds of dead people are voting.
An analysis of recent elections in the state, ready for this, shows that 953 dead people voted.
After the investigation was complete, they found that only 5 ballots couldn't be accounted for out of the 1.3 million votes that were cast. But using that pretense, South Carolina still passed voter ID laws. Voter ID laws really only stop voter impersonation, that is, you going to the polls and claiming to be someone that you're not and casting a vote. Between 2000 and 2014, there have only been 31 cases of that happening in the entire United States. Again, using voter fraud as a pretense, Texas passed one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country, disenfranchising 600,000 people. Between 2002 and 2014, only 2 people have been convicted of voter fraud in Texas. Imagine for a moment, over the course of 12 years, 2 people committed a crime with an AR-15, and as a result, the state took away 600,000 AR-15s from people who did nothing wrong. Not permanently, don't worry, you can get it back. You just need to take some time off work, go to the state ID office, wait for a few hours, pay a fee, and wait for it to arrive in the mail a few weeks later. This isn't that much of a stretch. Voting is a right just as much as owning a firearm. Texas has one of the most interesting and strictest voter ID laws in the country. The issue isn't that you need an ID, it's which IDs count. Most people have some form of ID to work or go to school or whatever, but those don't count in Texas. Wisconsin allows school IDs, which makes sense, it's a state-run government institution. But Texas doesn't. You know what does count? A concealed carry permit. I can't imagine any difference between people who carry CCLs and people who carry school IDs. Huh. And here's where we get to talk about discrimination. Voter ID laws are often described as useless since it solves a problem that isn't really a problem, but also racist, which usually makes people defensive and use some of the arguments that I've already mentioned. Again, the problem isn't that you need an ID, it's which IDs count as valid voter IDs. As I said before, 11% of all Americans don't have a valid voter ID. Only 8% of white Americans don't have one, while 25% of African Americans don't have one. These laws disproportionately affect poor people who who also tend to be minorities. Anyone has the legal ability to go get a state-issued ID, provided they have the necessary paperwork like their original birth certificate or proof of name change. But not everyone has the financial ability to do so. Even if the ID itself was free, if you have to take off work for several hours to go get an ID when you didn't need an ID to get to work or do anything else, that might not be a cost that you're willing to pay in order to go vote. Which is why some people claim that it's effectively a new form of poll tax. It's an unnecessary barrier to voting that didn't exist before and won't really solve any problem. Using a fake ID to vote will be just as easy as using one to buy alcohol. It won't stop the small amount of voter fraud that exists, but it does stop minorities from voting. Let's take a look at North Carolina. You'll notice that it doesn't currently have any voter ID laws because it was struck down by the courts.
Although the new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision, they constitute inapt remedies for the problems, assertedly justifying them, and in fact impose cures for problems that don't exist.
The North Carolina legislature pulled racial voting data and crafted the law around that to purposefully disenfranchise African American voters with, what did they call it?
Surgical precision. With race data in hand, the legislature amended the bill to exclude many of the alternative photo IDs used by African Americans. As amended, the bill retained only the kinds of IDs that white North Carolinians were more likely to possess.
If you needed any more proof that voter ID is discriminatory, that should do it. It's not that you need an ID, it's which ones count. Why do you think Texas allows CCLs but not school IDs? But that's not all they did. They discovered that a lot of African American voters used same-day registration, so they got rid of that. They also cut early voting from 17 days down to just 10, because that racial data indicated that a lot of African American voters tended to vote early during those first 7 days, which eliminated a Souls to the Polls Day when churches would bus people to go vote. Do I need to tell you who used that? Likewise, in every state that has voter ID laws, you only need to present an ID if you vote in person, not if you do a mail-in or absentee ballot. Guess who that favors? There's a trend here. When you register to vote, you have to identify yourself and show some sort of proof of residence to establish your address. Usually a utility bill or a lease. Seems simple enough. But when North Dakota passed a law requiring every registered voter to have a valid street address, they effectively disenfranchised Native Americans who live on reservations, because the post office still hasn't gotten around to giving them physical addresses. Even if you have an address, you're registered to vote, and you have a driver's license or state-issued ID, you may go to the polls and find out that you've been purged. Which is exactly what happened in Georgia a few weeks ago. Brian Kemp, who's running for governor and also happens to be the current Secretary of State, purged almost 500,000 people from the voter rolls, 70% of which were African American. One of the justifications is that they didn't pass an exact match, which requires all state documents to have the exact same spelling and spacing of your full name and address. They used computers for this, of course. No one's gonna go through all those documents by hand.
Now that is something that would impact me directly, because I've had an issue with my middle name. I'm not going to tell you guys what it is, but there was a spelling error with my middle name, and some places have what my middle name was supposed to be, and other places have the one with the error in it. Even to this day, I don't know exactly which one I'm legally registered under. So if something like this were to be implemented, it would be something that would affect me directly.
And they could have learned how to program those computers by going to skl.sh/knowingbetter3. Skillshare is an online learning community with classes taught by experts in their field. Learn C++ from scratch in this set of courses and realize that missing a space in your address isn't the only thing that can ruin your life.
Okay. Yeah. Skillshare looks interesting, especially for programming. I'd love to be able to create a video game at some point. It doesn't have to be something complicated, but you know. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link for Knowing Better's Skillshare thing. I'm going to continue to see if there's any more.
skl.sh/knowingbetter3 to get 2 months of unlimited access to all of Skillshare's courses for free, and you'll be supporting the channel when you do. He did this after the voter registration deadline, so you won't be able to fix this before Election Day. People were also purged for not voting in previous elections. Most states have something like this known as use it or lose it. you're removed from the voter rolls for not voting in the previous general, midterm, or sometimes even off-year elections. Yes, there are off-year elections. There's an election literally every November. Many of these laws have good-sounding intentions on their surface, but background negative consequences. They may not always have nefarious intent, but they will have nefarious effect. It is your duty as an informed citizen to think about these intents and consequences, especially if it affects people who might not have the right to vote like you, because now you know better.
Well, there we go. So, again, there are many laws that are put in place, and a lot of times they have nefarious ulterior motives, and on the surface it might not seem like it's that bad. There's a lot of people that will probably even defend certain laws, but the thing is, a lot of times these laws are designed to target and affect specific types of people. Like, for example, in New York, they had the stop and frisk law. I'm not sure if they still have it, but it was something at one particular time. And that was something that targeted a specific type of people. In Arizona, they had the law where they could stop and ask you for your papers. Obviously, that law was designed to stop a certain type of people. I'm willing to guarantee they weren't stopping people and saying, hey, you look kind of Canadian. Let me see your papers. I'm pretty sure they weren't doing stuff like that. But, yeah, there's a lot of times where stuff like this will happen, and there are people that will defend it. I want to bet there are people that, well, I'm not going to sit here and try to generalize and point the finger at people, because there are some people that might have arguments for why some of these laws are in place. But at the same time, you should be willing to understand that these laws also impact a certain type of people more than others. And it was interesting that he said that there were laws that were impacting people that didn't really have there wasn't an issue with it at first, and they just created a law just for the sake of creating pretty much creating a problem that wasn't there. Because there's a lot of things going on right now where that's the case. Personally, that's why I believe about the whole build the wall thing. Like, I think that immigrants coming into the country are not that big of a deal, especially over the border like that. Because from my understanding, most illegal immigrants are coming in through ports of entry. They're just overstaying their visas, and that's how illegal immigration happens. So it doesn't matter how much you want to fortify the walls of the house, if you still leave the door open and they're welcoming people in, and they're just like staying, like getting lost in the house and never leaving, you reinforcing the walls ain't going to change anything. Now, I don't know any way of actually like affecting that. I mean, you can try to make the vetting process stronger, of course, but I don't think we should just shut everything off. But whatever, that's a deeper conversation that I honestly will admit I don't know enough about. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to just how bad the problem that these laws are targeted towards are. And a lot of times I don't think that they are. I think politicians are very good at not only using scapegoats and trying to target certain things and try to create problems that aren't there to help themselves, but they're very good at manipulating the public to support those laws that don't impact anything, or even worse, might impact the people that they're trying to get to support it. And they'll create these laws to create a problem that wasn't there. And these laws a lot of times will be something that will directly impact the people that are supporting it, or the politicians will phrase it a certain way so that the people that are impacted by it most are going to try to support it. And it's just about getting informed. Like, you have to try to get and understand, like, does this impact me directly? What, like, because it's a lot of stuff that I don't really want to get into because I want to try to keep the video like focused on one thing, and that's voter disenfranchisement. I don't want to get too into like other politics and stuff, but disenfranchisement is more than just creating laws that say this person can't vote or these people can't vote or whatever else. A lot of times it's more subtle than that. A lot of them have very prejudiced or racist backgrounds, and they're intentionally designed that way. Sometimes it's because the people implementing it could very well just be racist. A lot of times they might not necessarily be racist, but they will use race as a scapegoat to try to, blame problems on and get support for whatever it is they're doing, or just support in general, just so they can try to get elected by exaggerating or instigating a particular community to go out and vote or want to vote even more. But whatever. At some point, we all have to get together and try to understand our places in society, and like I said, try to stick together. We shouldn't have poor people going against other poor people when it comes to laws that benefit poor people. Same with other levels of society as well. But at the end of the day, that's all that is. I'm Devon DaVinci. I know I was all over the place when I was explaining stuff. A lot of times I will see a video that I want to react to. I will mark it off, and then when I go to react to it, I will go into it blind. A lot of times I do this intentionally, and I've explained why I do it intentionally, but it also leaves me unprepared for certain things I want to talk about. And there's no way for me to know what might particularly pop up in the video, because in order for me to know that, I'd have to watch the video. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that will pop up that I feel like talking about, but I don't have the source material right in front of me, so I can't obviously give you quotes and statistics and point directly at something. But at the same time, I will openly admit that what I'm usually saying will be subjective, or it will be an opinion, or it will be something that's not based on a fact. So hopefully, if you hear me talking about something, it's something that you can use as a guide to go and investigate and learn the facts yourself. So with that being said, I'm Devon DaVinci. Hopefully you've just been a little more enlightened. If you haven't, then be sure to post something in the comment section and try to enlighten me. And I will give you the deuces. I look forward to seeing you guys in my future videos. I will have Knowing Better's channel linked over here in this video. You can click on it. The last 30 seconds it'll pop up. It'll take you straight to their channel. You can subscribe to them, watch all the other videos, because they have a ton of other videos talking about subjects similar to this, not just about voting and things like that, but a lot of historical topics. And I will have a link for Knowing Better's Skillshare promo. So if you want to go ahead and do that, you can click on the link in this video. And I'm going to go ahead and move on. It looks like he also has a Patreon, so I will leave a Patreon as well, the Patreon link, if you want to show support on there also. Always watch the original videos before you watch the reactions. I'm Devon DaVinci, and I'm going to give you the deuces, and I'm signing out. Deuces.